Welcome everyone to Composting and Gardening. My name is Patricia Barrett. I work for the University of Missouri Extension in Miller County, Missouri. I'm also a Master Gardener and the Master Gardener Coordinator for our local Lake Area Master Gardener chapter. What we want to discuss today is composting and why it benefits our gardens to compost our waste material and turn it into improved soil composition. So here's an example of a bucket that you might have on your garden or on your deck, and you've got kitchen materials, you've got eggshells and refuse from making salads and cooking in the house. And you've also got some weeds that you may have pulled that you're going to allow to decompose in that bucket. And as they decompose or when they decompose, we're going to add those to our garden and improve the quality of its soil. So what is composting? That's a good question. We're here to answer that question. It is the decomposition of organic materials into an end product that is known as compost. Invertebrates, microorganisms, and those include insects and earthworms, and bacteria and fungi, like my husband, he's a fun guy, help in this transformation. They break all the materials in the organic materials down into a sort of a melded soil supplement. To put it simply, composting is recycling. So we're going to talk about the components of compost. They start with organic waste. That starts with your kitchen scraps. It starts with your weeds and your leafy material, the kind of things that are basically organic waste. They're left over from the processes of cooking or mowing or leafy drop materials, those kind of things. Microorganisms that we talked about, the invertebrates and the bacteria and the fungi and the insects work together. They combine with water and air. They produce carbon dioxide and heat. All four of those elements combine to transform organic waste into compost. And the end product of this concentrated decomposition is nutrient-rich soil that can help crops, garden plants, and trees to grow. So why? Why is it important? Why do we care? Why shouldn't we just throw it in the trash? Here's why. Number one, it reduces our waste stream. That's a very important thing. We all know that we have bags and bags of trash that we create. If we can just reduce that stream by 10%, just think of how that would lessen the burden on our landfills. Compost improves soil structure. We are feeding back the nutrients that the soil gave to the plants that grew in that soil. When we took those plants out, when we converted it into something else, believe it or not, we removed nutrients from that soil. Composting adds those nutrients back into the soil. Composting retains moisture. It slows runoff from rain by creating soil that has a lighter texture, that has more nutrients in it, that has more organic material, which is extremely important for good quality soil. That increases the soil's ability to hold moisture and to slow runoff. And we reduce the need for fertilizer by adding these nutrients back in to the soil in a way that the soil and the plants that we're trying to grow in the soil can easily take back up. How do gardeners use compost? Well, there are various ways to use your finished compost. You can sprinkle the compost on top or mix it in to your flower and vegetable beds. You can gently rake it into tree beds. You may blend it with potting soil in order to revitalize indoor plants. You may spread it on top of the soil on your lawn as a soil amendment. One of the easiest and most interesting ways to use compost is to make compost tea. Yes, this is not your mother's afternoon tea. This is a product that is made by adding compost into a bucket for a few days and filling the bucket with water. After a few days, that material and that water will turn brown. Well, basically, it has the nutrients suspended in the water. And you may spread this brown water on your plants or on your garden. And it will actually, it's very beneficial for new plantings because it's easy for small root systems to take up those nutrients. And you can use the compost that's left over by just raking it into your garden. There's a little history involved in compost, believe it or not. Romans, Greeks, and the tribes of Israel all knew about compost. Even the Bible and the Talmud refer to composting. Basically, what ancient man did is the same as what today's man does. They save the materials that are left over from their food products, and I'm going to go into more detail about that later. And they amend their soil. They put it back into the soil so that the soil can reuse it again. We see that certain authors like Shakespeare, Sir Francis Bacon, and Sir Walter Raleigh all mention the use of compost. Who popularized compost recently? So in 1930, J.I. Rodale started Rodale Incorporated. R.D. Rodale continued his father's work. Here are a couple of Rodale Press books from my library, and I will tell you that I inherited them from my Uncle Ted, who was not a master gardener, he was an amateur gardener. He grew strawberry beds. He had different projects that he liked to do out in the yard. And so one of these very old books, Rodale Gardening on the right, is from his collection, and How to Grow Vegetables and Fruits Using the Organic Method is also a very classic book that I have in my library that I do refer to from time to time. Just because we're more modern doesn't mean our plants and our gardening methods have to change. So there's a process that goes through as the organic materials decay into compost. And there's ways that one thing that we do like to do to make things a little more efficient is to try to speed up that process. In the environment, the process requires air, it requires water, it requires food, which would be your organic material, and it requires a temperature. The more temperature there is, the better temperature there is, the faster the decaying process will occur. And so one of the things that we do to speed up the compost process is we have to turn our compost pile. It can be very laborious to go out with a pitchfork or a shovel, and we just have a static compost pile somewhere in a corner of the garden, and we take it and we have to turn it once every 7 days. That's a recommendation. Constant turning brings the cool organic matter on the edges of the pile into the heated core, and the center of an organic pile of compost will heat up, and decomposition will happen more rapidly. And that also increases air circulation, and this boost of oxygen hastens the microorganism activity. I've pictured on the right what an item that you can purchase called a compost roller. Where that green door is, you would open that green door, you would insert your organic materials and your brown materials, which we will discuss shortly. You close it back up and you turn it, and you give it a turn every time you add more materials. That the fact that it's closed up kind of concentrates heat, and when you can roll it or turn it, that adds air, and of course, the organic materials has water in it, but if it's not decomposing enough, you add a little bit of water to increase the activity. So there's a couple processes that can be used, and I just talked about the one, hot composting, where everything goes into the barrel all at once. The idea is to get the temperature up to 110 to 140 degrees. That sounds really high, but believe it or not, as composting and as decomposition is occurring, the temperature naturally raises in these compost barrels that like the one pictured in the video. It might take 3 to 4 months to get a finished compost product. Cool composting is basically slow composting. It's like slow cooking. You have a continuous pile, you add materials as you go. There are different methodologies that you can use to spread this material, trenching and sheet or lasagna gardening, and we will talk about that shortly. So one thing we want to make sure that we do when we create a compost pile is know what we're adding to our pile. And according to the EPA, a balance of greens and browns is necessary to create the proper environment for composting to occur. Greens, listed on the right, are the nitrogen-rich items, and they include grass, they include fruit and vegetable waste, they include coffee grounds. Browns are the carbon-rich yard clippings like dead leaves, branches, and twigs. Those are the dried materials that are not green, that are not garden materials, that are not scraps, those kind of things. But you need them both to create a quality compost product. A carbon, which is the brown, to nitrogen ratio of 25 to 1 and 30 to 1 is ideal for rapid composting. Microorganisms feed on both the carbon or the browns, and they feed on the nitrogen. The carbons give the microorganisms their energy, and the nitrogen provides nutrition so the organisms can keep growing and producing. And here's a quote that I enjoy, and I will make sure that you can read it properly. The realization that no matter what you do, no matter how many mistakes you make, you are still probably going to come up with reasonably good, usable compost. A basic understanding of the life forms and the processes that operate within a compost pile, a willingness to experiment, a little effort, and a little artistry. Those are the 5 requirements of successful composting, according to Stu Campbell, the author of Let It Rot. So, as in gardening, it's always an experiment, it's always a process. Do not be afraid, it does not have to be perfect. Certain materials that we add in a compost pile require special handling. Those products include cardboard, corn cob stalks, diseased plants, grass clippings that have chemicals on them, and that is an important thing to be aware of. Hedge trimmings, lime, and that is an agricultural lime, nutshells such as walnut or pecan, and we will talk about that shortly too, peat moss, pine cones, rhubarb leaves. These are all products that have certain high proportions of nutrients that we don't necessarily want in our compost pile in large volumes. Sawdust, sod, soil, walnut leaves, weeds, and especially weeds, wood ash and wood chips are all things that we need to make sure that we are properly accounting for and that we are handling appropriately. Certain things are not to be put into a compost pile, and that's for very specific reasons. I didn't talk about black walnut, but here's the point about the black walnut materials, the scraps and the leaves and the stems. They have a chemical called jugalone, and that chemical will stop things from growing. It's why you don't see a lot of flowers and trees underneath a walnut tree. Coal or coal ash may have certain chemicals, like something that we use to burn that could be harmful to plants. Dairy products, like eggs, like fats and oils, and meat or fish or bones, have odor problems, and they may attract unwanted pests like rodents, like flies. Some diseased plants that may have certain fungal diseases may survive and might be passed along if they are incorporated into your compost pile. Pet waste. You don't want to put pet waste into your compost pile. They may have parasites. They may have bacteria. It's just not appropriate to add that to a compost pile. Yard trimmings, sometimes we use chemicals that are used to, just like to prevent crabgrass, these kind of things. And quite frankly, those might transfer into your garden and restrict the growth of your product. And when we talk about biosolids, the truth is, biosolids is a marketing term. It's a euphemism for sewage sludge. Sewage sludge is what remains of everything that is flushed down the sewers. And that includes human and animal waste. It includes industrial chemicals. It includes medical waste, and sometimes we excrete medical waste. We don't necessarily absorb all the medications that we take. Oil products. Sometimes people put oil products down the toilet. Pesticides, home cleaners. After the water is removed, the marketers who came up with the term biosolids, and they did it by holding a contest, may want you to, they did it by holding a contest. I'm going to repeat that for emphasis. What's a polite way to use biosolids. They want you to think of it as natural. To that end, they've invested a ton of resources. I'm just gonna pause. And I'm back. What's wrong with using compost made from sewage in your garden? After all, it's been treated and tested. Right? Well, guess again. Allowing sewage to cure for a period of time does not remove its toxins. And I know that now you can't hear me. So stop recording. Okay. I'll start over again. What's wrong with using compost made from sewage in your garden? After all, it's been treated and tested, right? Wrong. Allowing sewage to cure for a period of time does not remove its toxins. Heavy metals, including lead and mercury, as well as such industrial compounds as flame retardants, persist, even concentrate during the cure of sewage. And some biosolids are treated to remove a small number of heavy metals, but compost may be heat treated to kill some pathogens, but heat treating does not kill them all. And how do you know the compost was treated properly? The other thing we want to talk about, do not dispose of charcoal briquettes, ashes in a compost pile, because the toxins may taint the compost and the plants that will later grow in it. Charcoal briquettes containing lighter fluid are especially toxic for you and your family, and they should never be thrown into compost or worked into soil. Clay-based and sand-based and crystalline pet litter are not compatible for use in compost because they can damage the structure of your soil and they can cause synthetic toxins to leak into your garden. The best choices for compostable cat litters are those made from natural living sources. How about fish scraps? And why do I have 2 stars on that? Because you can compost fish remains. In fact, the early Native American folks did that. That was a big part of their 3 sisters method of gardening. They would bury the compost, the fish remains, and underground composting allows for the composting of fish because number 1, it doesn't produce an odor or attract pests. To compost fish remains underground, dig a hole about 18 inches deep, fill it with 6 inches of scraps, if you have that many, and then cover the scraps with 12 inches of soil. Allow the compost to decompose in place for almost a year. The compost can then either be dug up and used to condition soil elsewhere, or vegetation can be planted directly over the compost. Roll that in. So turn it to add oxygen. Keep all those worms and bugs and microbes happy and eating your browns and greens by turning the piles with a pitchfork, or if you've got a roller, keep that roller moving. What are some of the benefits of compost? We'll just recap those again. Number 1, they reduce pressure on landfills and they help you avoid having to find an alternative disposal method. They provide a slow release of nutrients. They increase organic material in the soil. They improve the texture and the structure of soil. They increase the population of earthworms, which by themselves improve soil structure. And soil treated with compost produces plants with fewer disease problems. Now let's discuss a couple of issues with a compost pile. Number one, the pile smells bad. It might be too wet. It might be too tight. It might be both, which makes it anaerobic. Turn the pile to loosen and move the air exchange. If it's too wet, also turn the pile, but at the same time, add more dry materials. Odors may also indicate that there may be animal products in the compost pile. If it smells of nitrogen, if it smells of ammonia, there's probably too much nitrogen in there. Add leafy material, add some wood chips, add some straw. It's going too slow. There's no decomposition happening. Add water, turn the pile. The pile's too dry. The compost is moist enough. The center is warm, but it's not hot enough to break down completely. Again, the pile's too small. Add more materials, make a larger pile. Turn and mix the old ingredients that may have only slightly decomposed into the new pile. If the pile's not small, more nitrogen may be needed. And that's your greens. Remember, nitrogen is your greens. The heap is moist and sweet smelling, but it doesn't heat up. There's not enough nitrogen in that pile. You need to add more greens. You might even add some fertilizer in there. Don't be afraid to do that. I have thrown leftover fertilizer onto my pile to try to help it decompose. In addition, there's other nitrogen sources that we could discuss, but this is polite company, so we're not going to talk about them today. You can ask me privately. And there are animals attracted to the pile. Well, that's likely because you may have meat or grease in there. And this is why we don't want meat or grease in the pile, because we really don't want to attract animals and have them digging our pile up every time anyway. So here's a couple methods that you might use to transform your composting. Number one, trench composting. Year one, take a 1 foot wide trench on the left hand, add your organic materials, cover that with soil. And remember to make sure you cover it. The center section is open, and you plant your crop on the right side of the pile. Section two, dig a trench on the right side of the pile and put your compost in there, cover it up, put your plants in the middle, walk on the left side. And year three, you're going to compost down the middle, and you might move your plants over one step to the left, and you're walking on the right side. That's a very simple methodology for trench composting. As it rains, as the plants grow, all that compost will decompose into both sides of the area and continue to enrich your soil. There's another methodology. We call it lasagna gardening. No, it does not involve noodles, red sauce, and mozzarella. It has several layers. The lasagna methodology is a layered methodology of gardening. The lowest level is the least broken down materials. Those are branches. So you put some mulch on top of that, some broken up pieces of mulchy material. You put your grass clippings, which is your nitrogen, on the next layer. Your newspaper and cardboard, which will break down, that's a brown. Then put actual compost on top of that, and on top of everything else, put some straw mulch. You can plant right into that barrel, and over time, the amount of material in that barrel is going to shrink as it decomposes, but you can add more materials year after year. And so anything that you can use in a compost pile could be used in a lasagna garden. And here's a couple of examples. You can see, obviously, that there are all sorts of kitchen scraps. So you can add the kitchen scraps, but leave the meat, the bones, and the dairy out of it. You can add fruit and vegetable, coffee grounds, tea leaves, and tea bags. And I put the coffee filters in as well, the paper filters. You can use weeds if they don't have seeds. Seeds will persist, but if your weeds are not seeded, go ahead. You can put seaweed in there. You can use shredded newspaper, pine needles. Leftover blooms from the garden, grass or lawn clippings, woody material, wood chips, aged manures. Don't be afraid to add manures. They're certainly going to enrich your soil. You can add peat moss, sawdust, or hay. And here's another methodology. You lay the newspaper on the ground. You add compost and manure. You add a couple inches of green grass. Remember, that's your nitrogen. You're going to spread that out. Add leafy material. Don't be afraid to use those leaves. They are full of nutrients. Top it with some additional compost that you might have left over. You might buy it in a bag. It's 2 feet deep by then. And you've completed a raised bed, a raised lasagna bed in 2 hours. I think 2 hours is a very hopeful time frame to complete that, but there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, if I've got all my materials together, I can get a bed together in a couple of hours. Sheet composting is another methodology that people use quite often. There's a couple of different tumblers that people might use to create compost. There's a little can, and it's an attractive can you could put on top of by your kitchen sink that you might add your table scraps to. I keep a bucket by my kitchen sink. I add my scraps and I take those scraps out and add them to my compost barrel. There's another methodology, a large mulch bin that you can use. That's a big one. Here's a pallet construction for a compost bin. You're going to use 4 wooden pallets, zip ties or baling wire. You can build one with chicken wire. All you need is woven wire and 4 plastic ties. There's an example. I have instructions for these at the end of this presentation. Here's an example of a compost pile that's made with cinder block. Why do they have 3 sections? You can you can keep various levels of compost in those different sections. You might throw all the greens in the middle. You might throw all the browns on the left, and you might throw your organic materials on the right, and you'd add your greens and browns on top of that to make better compost. So I'm going to thank you with that and end this and open this video up for conversation. All right. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.